So last night I bizarrely had a dream that I was doing a Kanye West Worst to Best video. I don't know what that means. Why would I dream about making a video? Is this the lowest point that I will ever get to? I don't know. Don't ever say dreams can't come true, because here it is, a Kanye West Worst to Best. Clearly my brain was telling me, you gotta do it, you gotta do it. Just to clarify, I will only be focusing on his solo albums, his solo work only. I don't really know if it would be worthwhile including his collaborative albums, because of course they are pivotal to his career. You know, Kids See Ghosts being one of the most critically acclaimed albums of the year. I, for one, wasn't that big on it, but still, I just want to look at Kanye West himself as opposed to the collection of artists that he's worked with in the past. I just want to look at the albums under his name. As always, tell me your rankings in the comments. I feel as I've seen 150 million ranked Kanye albums just in my lifetime, like constantly on Twitter or whatever, just talking to music people. It always somehow comes up and people are always ranking his albums. So you've probably seen 100 variations of this already, so maybe me adding to the conversation won't do a great deal, but hopefully you enjoyed the episode that I'm doing here. And it's fun to talk about his music anyway. There's always something to say, even if you're not particularly big on his music. There's always something to say. Okay, let's go into the list. Someday. Probably no surprise to anyone that Ye has ranked at the bottom of this list. I mean, you've probably seen my review earlier in the year where I basically shot it down for being just, I don't know, it just felt emotionally forced. And since then, we have actually found out that some of the songs weren't even written by Kanye himself, which takes away the impact of what this album was supposed to have completely, for me anyway, because, you can't be getting people to write songs that have this emotional weight to them. Context surrounding an album has always been important to me. I feel as though any album that is, led to be this emotionally powerful album and turns out to be not written by the person fronting the album, if Pink Moon wasn't written by Nick Drake, would you have the same opinion of the album? Like, you wouldn't, would you? You've got to have that in mind. And what do these songs really mean at the end of the day without Kanye's full vision being thrown into the writing of this album? It obviously doesn't change how the music sounds, I will say that, but for me the music on this album just doesn't really sound that good. I think the opening track is pretty ugly in the way it's presented, and musically it just takes so long to kick off, and the tracks following it really don't give me that much of an impression either. The Ghost Town Part 1 track, which a lot of people consider to be the best from this album, I always thought had some of the weakest vocals like that Kanye could have possibly chosen for a song like this, to be honest. It feels very natural, it feels very authentic, but just musically it didn't sound particularly that good. And as goes for most of the tracks on this album, actually, to be honest, I didn't really consider it to be a fully realized album. It came and went in 20 minutes, nothing left an impact on me, and it's just nowhere near as good as some of his best work. It just isn't. I don't see how a Kanye fan could consider this to be on par with his best work. Number 7, we have The Life of Pablo. Perhaps an album that people will rank a lot higher than me, but at the same time I feel as though within his discography or as a whole, it's not really a top quality release that he could have had. First of all, the album had a bit of a messy introduction to the world, to be honest. I mean, it came out, it had some mixing issues that people were straight away jumping on top of, and Kanye fixed those issues. He then, changed some of the aspects of the songs, then he did it again, and then he did it again, and it just kind of got exhausting to the point where I just lost interest in caring about what the final product sounded like. Like, surely it's just telling how little effort went into some of these tracks, knowing that they first came into this world not even being finished. I mean, how can you defend an album that has that going for it? Sure, the final product does sound a little bit better than it initially came out, but it's not that big. I mean, Wolf still sounds like ass. Some of the tracks in the middle of the album could have easily been cut. This was just a product of the streaming era to me. I think it was an over bloated 60-minute album, just like every, you know, hip hop release that decides to pile on all the tracks for 60 minutes these days end up sounding like. There's filler, there are tracks that are clearly considerably weaker than others, which is just a shame for me because it's never really been in Kanye's style to just kind of, you know, pile on an album for 60 minutes or whatever for no reason. Like, each track usually has its place, and this was one of the first times where, for me, a Kanye release didn't have that. It just didn't feel as focused, as tightly knit as his other albums. Even his debut and follow-up release were 60 minutes long, but it never felt like there were tracks that just were unnecessarily placed. They at least fit the theme and the style of the music on the album, whereas The Life of Pablo never felt that for me. Tracks like Real Friends, to me, as great as they are, like, it just didn't really fit the vibe of the album. You know, you've got these kind of pop bangers, you know, you've got The Weeknd, you've got Rihanna on the album as well. It just felt like this one was sort of shoehorned in, and even the highest high points, Ultralight Beam and No Parties in LA, for me anyway, were just never matched with some of the weaker tracks. It kind of just felt all over the place to me, but yeah, it still ended up just being a pretty average album overall, which was a shame. Number 6 on my list is Jesus. Yeah, the opinions on this album at first were very split, weren't they? I mean, most people were just confused by the sound that Kanye was playing with on this album, and some people were absolutely in awe of the genius of this album. For me, I mean, even 5 years later, I still feel like this album was a bit all over the place, thematically and stylistically. Like, there were some amazing high points on this album, but my god, some of the lowest points were just so hard to sit through. I have already done a video on this. I did it earlier on in 2018, but I still stand by some of the points I made, even though I think some of the tracks do end up, you know, sounding better now than they first initially did. It's kind of like one of those albums that you do have to sit with to sort of understand what's going on, but at the same time, lyrically, most of this album just felt kind of all over the place for me. Kanye often was just throwing anything out there, and there wasn't really a full-on structure to many of the tracks to me. Yeezus is an interesting album in Kanye's discography because even for hip-hop, this is pretty experimental and out there for a rapper to go and do this, which I absolutely appreciate, but just a final product didn't really end up being that great in my opinion. Even if it does, again, have some incredibly high points in my opinion, such as Blood on the Leaves. I still find Bound 2 hilarious. Black Skinhead is a great song too. To call it an outright terrible album I think would be unfair, but overall, for me, there were like 5 great songs and the other 5 I could have thrown away, which is funny because I would say that Ye was an album that was too short, but I would honestly shorten Yeezus to like a 5-track EP and it would be fantastic. So, you know, it just ended up being pretty average overall.
I'm not loving you way I wanted to, what I had to.
Number 5, 808s and Heartbreak. Another album in Kanye's discography that's pretty much split, you know, in the audience that love it and the audience that absolutely hate it. I mean, to be honest, I always thought it was just an okay release. I do feel as though it hasn't particularly aged all that well, but when you take into account that how influential it ended up being for rappers in the future, for people like Drake, Travis Scott, Kid Cudi, plenty of others as well, even people like The Weeknd. The emotional side of hip-hop that hadn't really been seen before. I mean, not many rappers would go out their way, you know, at the height of their popularity to then go into like this R&B, you know, depressing album that no one would really see coming. And it did in fact spawn some of his biggest songs ever, like Heartless and Love Lockdown, and to me I still consider those some of the best Kanye songs ever. Yeah, just the sound of this album, I feel like at times was just a bit messy. I mean, people say the same about Graduation in the way that it hasn't particularly aged well, but I always thought this aged worse than Graduation. I don't know if my ears are just hearing something completely different, but tracks like RoboCop, oh, and even some of the lyrical themes across this album never really felt fully realized. Again, just another aspect of Kanye's career that I've always had a bit of an issue with. One aspect is completely out there and new and fresh, but then there's something slightly dragging it down, and this was just one of those releases for me where you can see that. But you can't deny the influence and the impact. I mean, it is pretty much a staple for music in the 2000s. Without this, emo rap, would it even be a thing? Would we even see artists today like Juice WRLD, Post Malone, you know, putting their emotions out there for everyone to see in a genre where that was never usually something that was acceptable? So I think this is why I have always had a bit of an appreciation for this album, even if I don't particularly love it. Alright, okay, this is controversial. I mean, I'm sorry. Look, I love My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. I do love this album. I think it's just a tad overrated, and it's always held me back in seeing the love for it that everyone else sees, because I personally think this album has a few weak tracks that could have honestly been a bit better. Tracks like Gorgeous, I'm just not that big on, honestly. And Devil in a New Dress, I love the instrumental on it, but I just think it goes on a bit too long. The whole Thank You Yeezy thing that goes on for like 3 minutes or whatever it is on the end of Blame Game, like it's just these little moments that just feel completely unnecessary that could have been taken away from this album, and then yeah, I'd be calling it his best album, but there are just things dragging it down slightly. But the highest highs on this album, again, some of the best we'll ever see in this decade for hip-hop. It is quite remarkable how he crafted songs like Runaway and the sample usage on Power, and you know, it is just incredible. Some of the music he put out there, All of the Lights, to me still sounds amazing today, even though, you know, you could argue that it's a bit dated with the production, but I just think it sounds amazing. It still gets you pumped up. I don't think lyrically this is really a strong point for Kanye West, certainly not when you look at his first two albums. I mean, he was penning some of his best songs ever on those releases, but you know, this album to me just showed what an artist can do when they just put all their effort into production and get as many people coming together to work together to create something so expansive and rich in its sound. You ain't just gonna get any old rapper or artist or producer producing songs on this album the way that Kanye and many other people were able to do here. I think it's one of those albums that's just an historical moment for music, and it has such an impact. It's been regarded a classic, you know, just 8 years later, and it's so easy to see why. But however, for me, there are 3 of his albums that are just a little bit better, and I'll explain why, because I think this is going to need some explanation for a lot of people. Number 3, Graduation, man. Yeah, I know Drunken Heart Girls is like his worst ever song. You don't need to tell me 100 times. Every time the conversation of Graduation comes up, someone has to mention that song. As if to say one song can make an entire album bad, but okay. No, but even without that, I get that people see this album as being dated. I get that people see this album a product of its time. But hear me out on this album, because I think this album gets a lot of flack for things that aren't exactly necessary. For one, I've always seen this album as a turning point, a sea change for music, because I don't think it was as common in 2007 to go in this pop direction that many other rappers, you know, around that time would have ever done. Sure, hip-hop was big in the 2000s, rappers had hits, you had people like 50 Cent that were churning out hits, you know, quite frequently. But the way Kanye did it, in the sense that he, you know, brought on pop singers, he brought in pop production to kind of bring these two worlds together, I think is something that needs to be praised a lot more than you see it get praised for. Sure, Stronger isn't exactly Kanye's best song, but I still think it's a good song, and I still think it's a song that showed how you can bring two worlds together and impact the future of music. Because I think only a few years later you really started seeing more artists like Pitbull come out of the woodwork, you know. Akon, I guess Akon isn't exactly a good example because he, you know, fell off the face of the earth. But like Tyler Cruz, you know, these just like kind of one-hit wonder type artists just kind of coming through, blending hip-hop and pop together to create some of the most well-known songs of that time, the biggest songs of that time. And I feel as though that's attributed to Kanye's graduation, to be honest. I've always seen its influence nearly matching the amount of influence that 808s and Heartbreak had, but perhaps not many people see that. I'm not sure if I'm just in the minority here, but it's just something I've always thought of this album. And sure, there are some weaker tracks here, but I mean, to me, they haven't really aged that badly at all. I can still listen to Flashing Lights and get the same enjoyment out of it as I would have in 2007. The same with Good Morning. You know, the same with Homecoming with Chris Martin. Everything I Am with DJ Premier just has wonderful production. I think the production on this album is really good, and at times on par with what he was doing on My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, to be honest. But I just can't seem to find anyone that agrees with me. Barry Bonds with Lil Wayne, I see a lot of people calling that a terrible track. I've always loved it. I thought Lil Wayne kills it on that song, to be honest. Can't Tell Me Nothing. Dude, these tracks are great. I don't see what's so bad about this album or what's aged terribly about it. There's definitely an argument to be had that this isn't his third best, though. I can see how people would think, well, Ryan, why would this be a number 3? But I've just always had this personal connection with this one. Like, I feel as though a lot of Kanye albums usually have one track that drags it down for me. Like I said with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, and I'm not really all that in love with a track like Gorgeous. Even the College Dropout has a few that I would personally cut. Like, it's not like Drunken Hot Girls is the only time where Kanye's made an album that has one bad song or one song that could be thrown out, because I personally think most of his albums have always had that anyway. Perhaps I've just always been a bit confused with people's attitude toward this album. I don't think tracks like I Wonder or Champion have aged badly at all, but yet I always see people say that about this album. I don't know. So yeah, perhaps not his third best, but certainly my third favourite album from Kanye West. But what's going to be number 2? Because whatever's number 2, you know what's going to be number 1.
Yeah. This the real one, baby. I'm telling you. Chi-Town stand up.
The College Dropout at number 2. Yeah, man, The College Dropout is an album that I think is up there for one of the better debut releases from a rapper you could probably find out there. In 2004, this was an album that was pretty pivotal for its time, because I think Kanye was able to add these jazzier, soulful instrumentals on an album while fusing it with a more modern sound that really helped change the game. Kanye's always been an artist that's been seen to change the game multiple times, but I think people should always recognize that tracks like Jesus Walks for its time were pretty innovative, in the sense that, you know, you're bringing in religion, you're bringing in this heavy lyrical theme on a track, while also not forgetting that you're needing to make a great pop sounding song, and he was able to do that on this album. Usage of skits on this album were pretty damn funny as well, and even still sound quite funny to this day. Tracks like We Don't Care still sound fantastic. All Falls Down, to me, is gonna always be like a top 10 Kanye song of all time. Lyrically on this track, and pretty much across this whole album, he is on his A game. I mean, you can't really say the same for a track like Breathe In, Breathe Out, but that to me has just always been like a prime Ludacris track, you know, like back in Ludacris's prime, this was the kind of shit he was coming out with, and it always just came across as really funny to me. That over-exaggerated ridiculousness that also found its way onto tracks like The New Workout Plan. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have always saw this one as one of his weaker tracks, but it's just so much fun to me. While also bringing in the heavy material that you would get on many other tracks too. This is an album I would say is a little overbloated though. I would probably cut out one or two tracks, maybe just to bring the runtime down a little bit. Never Let Me Down, Get 'Em High with Talib Kweli on there as well. Some amazing tracks that I think hold up to this day. And of course you cannot forget Through the Wire. I mean, what rapper can you say has ever done a song like that? It's an album I just always found so much enjoyment out of. You get such a variety of musicianship across almost every track, and it all feels like it's part of the same album. I think it's a really great release and definitely worthy of its #2 spot on this Kanye West ranking list. But it's not his best though. It's not his best album.
I gotta testify, come up in the spot looking extra fly. For the day I die, I'ma touch the sky. Gotta testify, come up in the spot looking extra fly.
Number 1, Late Registration. Yes, this is his best album to me. Even looking at his discography though, I just can't see how any other album in his catalog could be better than this one. This to me, from start to finish, is a perfect album. Like, I would go as far as saying this is a 10 out of 10 classic album, because I just don't think there's a single track on here I would throw out, which is amazing because this track listing runs 20 plus tracks. There are honestly so many tracks on this album that I would consider his best ever. Heard Him Say I would honestly consider one of his best ever songs. Touch the Sky, Hey Mama, Drive Slow, and even lyrically as well, across this entire album I just feel as though he's on it. He's just absolutely on it. Even on a track like Gold Digger, I mean, sure, it's not really one of his best ever songs, but it hasn't particularly aged all that badly either. I mean, there's some funny lines that hold up pretty well on that track. E Major is this 7+ minute track that is so expansive and so lush, and it just makes up every moment of its runtime. Musically as well, I think this album is honestly completely flawless. Just the production, the jazz feel across the entire thing, and as well as it having these ideas that again for its time weren't as common in hip-hop. And I think Kanye showed that when he puts so much effort into an album, musically and lyrically, he can make something special. You just hear the time and effort that's gone into the production on this just by listening to it. It is just so beautifully organized and arranged, the entire thing from start to finish. The skits on this one are hilarious as well. I just find so much enjoyment out of listening to the skits on this album. Yeah, and again, the entire theme of this release just works so well. And yeah, I just will stand by this for the rest of eternity and say that this is his best album. This is his best album, and I don't think he'll ever top it, honestly. I mean, if you disagree, that's totally fine. But yeah, Late Registration is the one. Again, let me know your thoughts on my ranking and where I've gone wrong, because I'm sure you won't agree. But then let me know in the comments as well what your ranking would be as well. Subscribe to the channel for more reviews if you enjoyed this video. Hope you did. Have a good day. And yeah, have a good day.